In a little-known, very rarely quoted passage in the New Testament, Jesus, speaking to the religious folk of his time, makes the following statement. He says, "Either make the tree good and its fruit good, or make the tree bad and its fruit bad, for the tree is known by its fruit. You brood of vipers, how can you speak good things when you are evil? For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. The good person brings good things out of a good treasure, and the evil person brings evil things out of an evil treasure. I tell you, on the day of judgment, you will have to give an account for every careless word you utter. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned." Whoa. That is a scary statement if you really think about it. That in the end, it all comes down to our words. How are we doing with that? Well, this is something of what I'd like to talk about this morning. Today I'd like to say a few words about words. Over the last few weeks in our ongoing study of the Ten Commandments, we have seen God dealing with some of the most basic, down-to-earth issues of human life. God has talked to us about home and family, life and death, marriage, property, and now words, our communication with one another. It's such a crucial issue. As we have noted in the past in dealing with many different topics, words are extremely important. They're powerful. On the very first page of the Bible, we are shown God creating through the spoken word. God said, "Let there be," and there was. Words are what create our reality, good or bad, and what connect us to one another. Just from our own experience, we know of the ability of words to alter the very course of our lives, to lift us up or to take us down, a word of encouragement or a word of ridicule. Words have power. They often make or break whole families, marriages, friendships, nations, churches. Words are powerful, but they're also very tricky. Recently, I heard someone tell of having gone out to dinner, and at the door of the restaurant there was a sign that read, "Shoes are required to eat here." Underneath of this, someone had scribbled, "But socks can eat anywhere they like." It's kind of like the little boy who thought that the word lackadaisical meant a shortage of flowers. That one kind of creeps up on you. Words are so vitally important to our lives, so powerful, yet so difficult to use well and properly. We're so easily tripped up by them. In this, notice that our commandment this morning is not the only one of the 10 pertaining to this matter. Remember number 3? You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Again, the power of words. What other subject gets 2 out of 10? So much of our trouble is centered in improper words and wrongful communication. Commandment 3 deals with our words with God, and Commandment 9 deals with our words with one another. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Scholars tell us that the original focus of this command was on giving false testimony in legal proceedings, in court. In the law of Moses, the penalties for such deception are severe because it is understood, particularly in a time before, cameras everywhere and DNA evidence and so forth, a time in which justice relied solely upon personal testimony, that the stability and connection of the entire society depended upon the words of the people. From this, we then see the extension of this commandment into the more general issue of lying. And this expansion of the commandment takes place fairly early on, as evidenced in a lot of Old Testament texts. The application of the commandment taken to include any deceptive, slanderous, idle, or empty talk about another person that would undermine their reputation or otherwise cast them in a bad light. This would entail not only deliberate efforts to deceive, but also the more casual gossip and rumor that often damage the regard or esteem in which someone is held. Again, the theme being lives destroyed through words. Basically, another way of putting this commandment is this: don't use your words in a false, hurtful way that destroys other lives. The reverse, the true intention of this commandment, which is use your words, your speech constructively. Communicate in a way that creates life. So how exactly do we do this? A couple of thoughts. First, speak truth. Obviously, the first point that God makes here is that our words need to be true. Without this, everything falls apart. We have nothing. Unfortunately, we all tend to spend much of our lives living lies. Our culture almost teaching us that this is a necessary part of survival, continually bending the truth, adapting it, adjusting it to suit whatever makes things go better for us right then. As Mark Twain once said, Most people must regard the truth as their most valuable possession. Why else would they be so economical in its use? We lie all the time. Someone once listed the following top 10 lies we all use every day, and see if any of these sound familiar. Number 10, I never got your message. Number 9, I'm going to start getting in better shape. Number 8, I only need 5 minutes of your time. Number 7, that looks good on you. Number 6, I hate to say this, but. Number 5, it's not the money, it's the principle of the thing. Number 4, I never said that. Number 3, I was just kidding. Number 2, I won't tell anyone else. And number 1, the diet starts tomorrow. There we go. We live on lies. But remember, Jesus tells us that the devil is the father of all lies. That is, lying is the heart of evil's work because it keeps us from life. As a noted pastoral counselor writes, the fabric of all healthy relationships is woven with truth. Lying tears this fabric apart and so destroys all trust and confidence in one another. Since God is truth, we cannot violate truth and still enjoy a relationship with him also. Truth is the roadmap for negotiating the difficult challenges of life. Without it, we get lost and we develop emotional problems that tell us we're lost. We often settle for half-truths or no truth at all because they're usually easier. But truth is the only road to emotional health. There is no other path. First basic point here is to speak truth. And if you can't, don't say anything at all, right? Without this foundation, everything else falls apart. We have nothing to build upon. Now, some will argue, but Pastor, what about the little white lies? They don't hurt anybody. Really? Consider the following true story. There once was a young pastor who was serving his first church, and on his first day there, the congregation decided to hold a covered dish luncheon to welcome him. They're good Methodists, right? Well, as the young pastor sat down to eat, one of the women of the church came over to talk to him, and as they were talking, she happened to notice that he had some potato salad on his plate. And the woman leaned over to him and she whispered, "Pastor, I see you have some of Mildred's potato salad." Well, let me tell you, Mildred is the worst cook on the face of the earth. Her potato salad is the driest, most disgusting thing you'll ever taste. Today's batch has to be the worst of all time. At that very moment, Mildred herself happened to walk by. And without missing a beat, the woman talking to the pastor turned and greeted Mildred warmly, concluding her greeting by saying, "Oh, by the way, Mildred, I just loved your potato salad this morning. Couldn't get enough of it." With that, Mildred continued on her way, and the woman turned back to continue her talk with the pastor. Needless to say, the young preacher was somewhat dismayed by the performance that he had just witnessed. But before he could completely gather his wits about him, the woman completed her greeting of the new pastor by saying, "Oh, by the way, Pastor, I just loved your sermon this morning. Couldn't get enough of it." Talk about not knowing where you stand, right? Well, that's what ultimately happens. Even the smallest untruth destroys the whole thing because it takes away any possible truth, any possible good. Rule number 1, speak truth. Rule number 2, speak love. Of course, it's not just enough to speak truth. Notice that the commandment tells us that we're not only not to bear false witness, that is to speak untruth, but also that our words should not be against one another, that is adversarial and hurtful. The text connects two themes regarding our speech: honesty and care for the other person. And that's not always an easy balancing act. The Apostle Paul, he speaks about this, and he gives us the following instructions from his letter to the Ephesians. He says, "But speaking the truth in love, we must grow up in every way into him who is the head of the body, Christ Jesus our Lord." Speaking the truth in love. This is what the commandment is really getting at. These two held in tension, truth and love. So how do we know when we're speaking lovingly? Well, the trick is to ask 3 questions before we say anything. First, does this need to be said? What we're about to say may be absolutely true, but does it need to be said? Does it serve any constructive purposes anywhere? A lot of the things we say, no matter how true, simply don't need to be said, and they shouldn't. It's like the old story I once heard of the editor of a small-town newspaper who grew tired of constantly being called a liar, and so he announced that from there on out he would tell only the truth in his newspaper. And the very next issue contained the following item, and it read, "Married, Miss Sylvan Rose and Mr. James Collins last Saturday at the Baptist Parsonage by the Reverend J. Gordon. The bride is a very ordinary town girl who doesn't know any more about cooking than a jackrabbit and has never helped her mother 3 days in her life. She is not a beauty by any stretch of the imagination, and she walks like a duck. The groom is an up-to-date loafer. He has been living off the folks at home all his life and is now worth absolutely nothing. It will be an extremely hard life for the couple. Needless to say, the editor was nearly run out of town by the family. You see, it was truthful, but it didn't need to be said. Too many people believe that every thought they have is a gem of wisdom and needs to be brought to the world. It doesn't, you know? Mark Twain once observed, "Some of the very best things I have ever said are those I kept to myself. A closed mouth gathers no feet." Closed mouth gathers no feet. First question, does this need to be said? Which leads us into the second question of loving speech. Why am I saying this? That is, what is my motivation in saying what I'm about to say? What am I hoping to accomplish? To help or to hurt? If it's to help, okay. But if we're really seeking just to make ourselves feel better at someone else's expense, then no go. You know, the story is told that a friend once came to the great philosopher Aristotle with some juicy gossip about another person. But before Aristotle would allow his friend to speak, he told him that whatever he was about to say must pass through 3 filters. First, is it truthful? Speak truth. Second, is it useful? Does it need to be said? And then finally, third, is it kind? Only that which passes all these filters is allowed to be spoken. Why am I saying this? You know? And then lastly, how am I being understood? What we are saying may be true. We may be looking to help, but the way we're saying it, the words we're choosing, is it getting that across? Are we communicating our message or something else? Oscar Wilde once said that the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. You know? As noted, words can be very tricky. Our choice of words themselves dramatically changes the meaning. It's like I once heard that when President Harry Truman was once speaking at a Grange convention in Kansas City, Mrs. Truman and a friend were in the audience, and Truman, in his speech, he said, "Folks, I grew up on a farm, and one thing I know, farming means manure, 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 and more manure." At this, Mrs. Truman's friend whispered in her ear, "Bess, he sounds so crude. Why on earth don't you get Harry to say fertilizer instead of manure?" "Good gracious, Helen," replied Mrs. Truman, "you have no idea how many years it's taken me to get him to say manure." Harry was used to a very different word, you know? Every word has a very different context and a nuance. They're not interchangeable. And each situation, there's a right word and there's a wrong word. It's not enough to know what to say. One must know how to say it, and then what we're actually saying. We must choose our words very carefully, not just fire off our mouths as we so often do. Think what the other person will and is hearing. Choose words for them and not for ourselves. Loving speech adjusts itself to the hearer. Do we do this? One author writes, "As a deaf child, former NFL star Kenny Walker felt like an outsider. As Kenny matured, however, he compensated for his deafness with great physical prowess. His larger-than-normal frame, extensive knowledge of football, and intense focus attracted the attention of his high school football coaches and, later on, many powerhouse college coaches. When Kenny's high school coach asked him where he wanted to play college football, he signed N for Nebraska, a team he had always dreamed of playing for. Nebraska's coaches immediately signed him and made arrangements to have an interpreter present at every practice and game. Kenny was so successful at Nebraska that he made All-American and was named Big 8 Conference Defensive Player of the Year. But the crowning moment of his college football career came during the final home game. Traditionally, senior players are introduced alphabetically and they run onto the field welcomed by a cheering crowd. But because Kenny was deaf, the university and local community plotted a unique way to praise him. In an article, a special article, the Omaha World Herald showed the fans how they could sign an ovation. They could stand, hold their hands over their heads, fingers spread, and then wave both hands from side to side. When Kenny stood in the stadium tunnel, he felt the vibration of the cheering crowd as each senior ahead of him ran out onto the field. But when he ran out on the field, he felt no vibrations. Puzzled, he stopped and looked around the stadium to see over 75,000 fans standing for him, waving their hands in a way that only a deaf person would recognize as applause. They adjusted their communication that he might hear love. Do we do the same? Rule number 2, speak love. Which leads us into then rule number 3, beware of the silences. You know, I believe we've been talking about words and the words we speak. I think it's also important just to take a moment to remember that we also often communicate through our silences. That is, some of the times where we choose not to speak can actually speak volumes. And we can bear false witness against our neighbor. We can speak untruth. We can speak hurtfulness. For example, whenever we hear someone make a racist or a bigoted remark, and we know better, and we fail to speak up, we fail to challenge that remark, in effect, we tacitly say we agree. Whenever someone gossips to us about another, says hurtful things about them, and we listen rather than tell them to stop, we participate in hurtful, destructive speech. As it has been said, gossip is the Protestant confessional, where we go to confess not our own sins, but the sins of others. You know, I once heard someone describe the person who listens to gossip as being like the person who fences stolen goods. He or she doesn't actually do the crime, but without them, there would be no place to market the goods, right? The fence is equally guilty as the thief because the fence makes the evil profitable and desirable. Bigotry, gossip. How about simply whenever we fail to speak the good we know and feel about someone, whenever we keep that to ourselves, is that not bearing false witness against them? Have you ever noticed how it is so much easier to complain and to criticize than to praise and to compliment? Why? How are we simply not speaking the good that we know? Someone once said, if you love someone, don't just feel it, tell them. If someone does a good job, don't just admire it, tell them. If someone is important to you, don't just know it, tell them. Always remember how much it is meant to you to actually hear those words. Good words are far too rare in this world. Just go online and see a bunch of rotten words. Rule number 3, beware the silences. All of which brings us to finally rule number 4, remember that your words matter. Author Dick Innes writes, I recently read about a middle-aged man who had been struggling with chronic depression for many years. His counselor told him that he would need to be on antidepressant drugs for the rest of his life. He told the counselor that his father, a self-made head of a large corporation, had repeatedly said to him growing up, son, when you inherit the family business, I expect that you'll ruin it. These words stung more painfully each time he heard them, year after year. Particularly as his father was a devout man and active in his church, these words seemed to him to be coming straight from the mouth of God. Well, when his father died, the man felt driven to work unreasonably long hours to prove his dad and supposedly God's prediction wrong. The pressure to avoid failure that relentlessly gnawed at him was quieted only by alcohol. Soon a serious drinking problem developed. His wife threatened to leave him. Finally, he succumbed to ongoing depression for which he could find relief only in drugs. His life was devastated by the power of his father's tongue. It has been said, with words we can bless or curse others, encourage or discourage, hearten or dishearten them. They can be powerful motivators or demotivators. Let us always use them as an instrument of healing and encouragement, and never use them to hurt, demoralize, or to destroy another person. Final point here, just returning to where we began. To remember that our words are powerful, that they matter. Simply put, building upon everything we've just considered, remember that somebody today desperately needs to hear a good word from us. Their life may depend upon it. Not destructive words, but constructive truth spoken in love. Will we offer it in a word of encouragement or praise, affirmation or support or compassion and hope? Most especially, will we remember that for a lot of people in the world who don't know God, our words may well be a word from God to them. Will we speak rightly for God or bear false witness against Him? What words will we speak? What life will we speak into being? You know, what's the old common slogan? You know, WWJD, what would Jesus do? Let's push that even further. Before every word that comes out of our mouths this week ahead, ask, WWJS, what would Jesus say? And if it isn't something He would say, don't say it. But if it is, say it. Christian author Jan Mitchell offers the following reflection. She writes, the promise was a long time keeping, but then so was the dream. In the early 1950s, in a small Southern California town, a little girl hefted yet another load of books onto the tiny library's counter. The girl was a reader. Her parents had books all over their home, but not always the ones that she wanted. So she'd make her weekly trek to the yellow library with the brown trim, the little one-room building where the children's section was actually just a nook. Frequently, however, she ventured out of that nook in search of heftier fare. As the white-haired librarian hand-stamped the due dates in the 10-year-old's choices, the little girl looked longingly at the sign that read, "The New Book," prominently displayed on the counter. She marveled at the wonder of writing a book and having it honored like that, right there for the world to see. She had occasionally hinted at wanting to be a writer, but everyone she mentioned it to seemed to discourage the idea as impossible. Well, this particular day, something came over her, and the little girl suddenly confessed her goal to the librarian. "When I grow up," the little girl said, "I'm going to be a writer. I'm going to write books." The librarian looked up from her stamping and smiled, not with the condescension so many children receive, but with encouragement. She stopped everything she was doing and looked at the girl straight in the eye and said, "Do it. And when you write that book, bring it into our library and we'll put it on display right here on the counter." The little girl beamed and promised that she would. As she grew, so did her dream. She got her first job in high school writing brief personality profiles, which earned her $1.50 each from the local newspaper. The money paled in comparison to the magic of seeing her words on paper. Still, a book was a long way off. After high school, she got married, and what with raising children and keeping track of the home and so forth, the dream of writing was put away. It was hard enough just to survive. But as the years passed, the dream, it just sort of kept coming back. Finally, one day, she decided that she was going to write a book no matter what. And so she sat down and wrote, and wrote, and wrote, and wrote. When she was done, she sent the manuscript to a number of publishers, only to be rejected by all of them. She put the book away, sadly. More years passed. She tried again and again. Finally, one day, a letter of acceptance. Now, the world of publishing moves very slowly, so it took another 2 years before she could actually see her book in print. But the day the box arrived on her doorstep with its free author's copy, she literally tore it open, and then she cried. She had waited so long to hold her dream in her hands. Then she remembered that librarian's words, her invitation and her promise. And of course, that particular librarian had died a long time ago, and the little library had been raised to make way for a new incarnation. The woman called and got the name of the new head librarian, and she wrote a letter telling her how much her predecessor's words had meant to a little girl. And she said she'd be in town for her 30th high school reunion, and could she please bring her book by and give it to the library as a gift. It would mean so much to that 10-year-old girl, and it seemed a way of honoring the woman whose encouragement had changed her life. The librarian called back and said, "Come." And so she did, clutching a copy of her book. When she arrived, she found the new library right across the street from the high school where she had gotten her first job. Inside, the librarian greeted her warmly, and also there was another woman. The librarian had taken it upon herself to invite the daughter of the former head librarian to share this day. She was overjoyed to be there in honor of her mother. The young girl, now grown, presented her book to the librarian, who placed it on the counter next to the New Releases sign. Tears rolled down all their cheeks. Each heart in its own way was so full. The three hugged, and then the writer left, pausing for a moment outside to notice the sign on the front of the library that read, "Welcome home, Jan. You did it." Overwhelming blessing, God's goal for a life fulfilled, all built on a few well-chosen and well-offered words. Who needs to hear such good words from us this week? That God's plan, that God's entire plan in their life and ours might be fulfilled. Someone once said, words are like wild horses, capable of tremendous beauty and power, but incredibly hard to corral. The 9th commandment, reminding us of the tremendous power of our words, calling us to be a people of constructive speech, a people whose words create rather than destroy life. This week, speak truth, speak love, beware the silences, and remember that your words matter. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Let us join together in singing our closing hymn, number 463 in the red hymnal, "Lord, Speak to Me." Would you please stand?